Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
For federal employees, contributing the maximum to the Thrift Savings Plan is often seen as a financial win. But in some cases, it may not be the best use of available funds. Balancing long-term investments with emergency savings, insurance coverage, and debt reduction can offer greater financial security, especially for those nearing retirement. Here with more details on those considerations is Certified Financial Planner Art Stein. Art, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Terry.
You know, a lot of times we have been talking about TSP investments, and we're assuming that people are making the maximum contributions. But that might not always be the right decision for folks, depending on their circumstances. So let's talk a little bit about how people should approach the level of investment that they're considering for their TSP.
Yeah, let's look at it like I would use three different examples. Somebody who's like within a year of retirement, somebody who's in the middle of their career, and then maybe someone who's just started out. And understand that this is very much an individual decision. It's a financial planning decision. What makes sense for one person won't make sense for another person. But when we do retirement plans, you know, we have people who are like within 1 or 2 years or even 6 months of retirement and want to know if they're ready. And many times we see a situation where they're maxing out their TSP contributions, and maybe they have a TSP loan they haven't paid off, or credit card debt, or they don't have enough auto and homeowners insurance, umbrella liability. And then we do recommend frequently, you know, instead of maxing out your TSP contributions, make a 5% contribution going forward so that you're building up your cash, you're able to pay off, you know, any credit card debt that you have. And also, you know, when you're really close to retirement, many people are going to immediately start taking funds from their investments when they retire. So it's not really such a good idea. It's not a terrible idea, but, you know, why put all of this extra money into the TSP when you're just going to be taking it out very shortly? But as always put in at least the minimum 5%, because the government's going to give you a 5% match. All of a sudden, you got a 10% contribution going in.
Well, there's certainly going to be a lot of people in the coming months who are approaching that retirement date, whether they've been taking the early retirement or they're separating from government service. So that's a really timely consideration. What about the mid-career folks? What should they be thinking about?
Well, mid-career folks, again, they want to look at whether they have emergency funds, the appropriate amount of insurance, and of course, they don't want to have any credit card debt. You know, it's okay to have a mortgage, even an auto loan. But if you have credit card debt, you know, that's a huge warning sign. And you want to pay that off as soon as you can. But except for that, I mean, it is great if they can max out their TSP contributions. And we would, in almost all cases, encourage that. What's a much more difficult situation is for people who are lower income federal workers who may find it difficult to even do a 5% contribution and yet pay for all the expenses that they have. Then you have to look at the personal situation. For instance, if somebody is single, no dependents, you know, life insurance is not a critical issue. If, on the other hand, you're looking at someone who's working, their spouse is not working, they have 2 or 3 kids, life insurance is critical, absolutely critical. And we would want them to get the maximum amount of insurance that they might need, but also understand that for someone who's healthy, outside term life insurance is probably going to be a better deal for them, more cost effective than what they can get from the TSP. Now, if they're not so healthy, then the ability to avoid underwriting, you know, a health check before you get insurance, then, you know, they would rely on FEGLI, the federal government life insurance program. So it just depends upon their situation. Of course, we would also encourage people to look at, you know, where's your money going? Keep track of your expenditures. Maybe say, I'm going to figure out how much I spent on different things the last 6 or 12 months. and maybe try and identify some other areas where you can save. Because if you're not making that 5% match to the TSP, you're passing up the opportunity to immediately double your money.
I'm speaking with Art Stein. He's a certified financial planner with Arthur Stein Financial. So, Art, let's go back to that sort of basic budgeting. As you're advising folks to lay out those expenses, and it could be for early careerists, it could be the pre-retirement folks, what are some of the big factors that should go into that personal budgeting?
Well, anything they spend money on, so like someone stops at Starbucks every day on their way to work, that's an expenditure. And if they're getting a $5 or $6 drink, that adds up. And it doesn't seem like much maybe, but that could be, $1,200, $1,400 a year. And maybe you make coffee at home and take it to work with you, get some Go cups and avoid that. One area where I think people tend not to include in their expenditures, because I just noticed this, after many, many years in the business, that almost none of the people we dealt with when they listed their expenditures included pets, the cost of their pets. And the ability to spend money on your pets, the probability of spending a lot of money on your pets has gone way up because medical care for pets has become very sophisticated and expensive, and people are getting, cancer treatments, and I've heard of brain surgery, all kinds of stuff for their pets. And that really adds up. Now, I'm not saying people shouldn't do that. We just want people to be aware of where their money is going and think about it. It's not a budget. It's just look at the historical expenditure patterns.
And then certainly you've seen it all, I can imagine. But how would you advise people to balance these sort of real-time, near-term expenses with the investment, the long-term strategy in TSP?
That becomes much more difficult. I mean, we have to rely on the people's good judgment, because I found that if I say to them, don't spend money on your pet, well, that's a no-go. You can't afford to own a horse. That's a no-go. I mean, they just don't want to hear that. That means a lot to them. And of course, I don't think there's an emotional connection to Starbucks, but there certainly is to a pet or a horse, but I want people to realize that those expenditures, if they're not able to put at least 5% into the TSP, has consequences that can be very serious. And I would also say this, Terry, that if someone who is young, say they just start working for the federal government, which probably is not happening that often now, but it hopefully will in the future, they are automatically enrolled in the TSP, and they automatically start withdrawing 5% from their paycheck to go into the TSP and one of the L funds, which I think is a great idea. It's a great program. Of course, they don't have to do that. They can say, I don't want my money to go in there. I don't want that much. I want it to go somewhere else. But what we found is that, people, if it happened automatically, they tended to stick with it. If someone starts at a young age and they're putting in 5%, they get the 5% match from the federal government. That's a 10% contribution. If they did that for the rest of their life and they worked for the government for a long time and they invested appropriately, they would be in pretty good shape when they retired, depending upon a whole bunch of other things. I'm reluctant to say that because we do, encourage people to put more in if they can. But the setting now is pretty good for people, as long as they can at least put in that 5%. That should be a major goal. And of course, starting early makes all the difference in the world.
The miracles of compound interest.
The miracles of compound interest.
I've been speaking with Art Stein. He's a certified financial planner with Arthur Stein Financial. Art, thank you so much for the sage advice.
Okay, thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.